Have you ever looked at a beautifully finished waistband or neckline and wondered how does that stay in place without any visible top stitching? Well, today we're going to go over this subtle but powerful technique, which is stitching in the ditch. We'll go over how to do it, what tools you'll need, when to use it, common mistakes, and how to avoid them. I'll also show you some of my clothes when I've used it so you can see this technique in action. Oh, if you're on the hunt for some good quality fabric to practice this with, I've linked my free favorite fabric stores list in the description. These are my go-to shops for fabric that sew like a dream. Stitching in the ditch means to sew right down the seam line. You use it to hold down something on the other side, such as a waistband or a facing. And when you sew in this ditch of the seam, it makes the stitching invisible because they sink down into that ditch. So it's an excellent technique. And if you don't want to be able to see your stitching on the outside of your garment. So I typically use this on waistbands. This waistband, I actually just serged it right along here. So I didn't need to use it for this. You could fold over the seam and then stitch in the ditch, but it's not typically what I do it for. I usually go to my side seam and I stitch in the ditch there. So this is the right side, and I'll go right down the seam just to hold the elastic in place so it doesn't shift around when I'm wearing it. You can see the stitching on the inside a little bit, but I'm okay with that. So this is a great way to keep my elastic in place. I also use it for the inside to hold down my facings. So this dress has a facing, you can see here, and I stitch in a ditch along the shoulder seam there. So on the outside, you can't see it. I'll stitch right down this seam. So it holds this so it's not shifting around. And I typically also stitch in the ditch here to hold the facing along the side. So I go right down the side as long as the facing is, and you can see the inside, it's held down. See, it's attached there. So it just helps the facing stay on the inside a little bit better. You really don't need that many special tools for stitching in the ditch. I typically just use my regular presser foot because I'm just sewing it very carefully and I go slowly. But you can also use this stitch in the ditch or edge foot that has this guide here that you put right in the ditch, and then it helps guide you. So if you're new to this technique, you might want to use this foot, but it is absolutely not mandatory. You also need pins. I think it will help to pin the two pieces together so you're trying to make sure that the seam is aligned in the front and the back. Me personally, if I see the stitching a little bit in the back because I went slightly off the seam, I really don't care that much, but pins will definitely help with that. And you also want to make sure that you have your seam is pressed very flat. It really does help when you're stitching in the ditch, going down the seam line if it's nice and straight and flat. And lastly, you want your thread to match very closely to your fabric because if I used a very brightly colored thread here, it would be much more noticeable than if I just use a pink or a white thread, and then it's just going to fade into that ditch. Now let's walk through how we stitch in the ditch. So we mentioned first you're going to press your seam really well. You want to make sure that ditch will be nice and sharp and deep. Then we're going to align the edge that we're securing behind the seam. So if this is our shoulder, like I showed you, I want to make sure those two seams are aligned. Or if I'm sewing a waistband, I'm going to do the same. We're going to place the needle directly in the groove of the seam. So be very careful here. You want to make sure that needle is going right in the ditch. And then we're going to sew very slowly. Seriously, slow down and keep your eyes right where the needle meets the fabric. Now, if you're going to be sewing something down like a waistband that you're folding over, and this is the way that you're attaching it, you need to make sure that you're catching that back edge. So as you're sewing along, make sure you're checking inside and that you're catching that inside layer very neatly. If you didn't, you may need to adjust, or maybe you want to hand stitch a small section first, or pin a lot, just to make sure that it is held down the way you want it to be. Some common problems that one has when you're doing stitching in the ditch, I think the most common one is that your thread shows on the outside. So I think the way to really avoid that is making sure that your thread color matches very closely, and you want to slow down. If you are wobbling, just continue to slow down and make sure your eye is on the needle. If you really are struggling with this, then I would definitely purchase one of the special presser foot to help you really align, to keep in the right spot, keep in the ditch. And if you're sewing down an inside layer and you're struggling with this, you might want to consider doing the whole thing from the inside rather than sewing from the outside, because then you can make sure you're going right and catching that inside layer. Now, the downside to this is that you might not then be in the ditch on the outside. If it's a waistband, it may not matter that much, particularly if your thread closely aligns with the fabric color. It won't matter if you're seeing a little bit of the thread, but it is more important in that instance that the inside is adhered and sewed down. And if you're finding that the two pieces of fabric are slipping and sliding and having difficulty staying aligned, definitely use a lot of pins, but you may want to break out your walking foot at that point to help that upper layer of fabric move equally with the feed dogs on the lower layer of fabric. That will just really depend on your fabric choice. I don't normally work with really slippery fabrics for that very reason. And if your stitches are really wobbly, you just need to slow down. I sew very slowly when I'm doing stitching in the ditch, and I typically can sew a regular seam very fast, but I just slow down. It's just not worth it to be wobbling around. And I think the pressure of doing this sometimes does get to you and makes you more nervous and makes you wobble even more. So I think slowing down is the best, or again, using the special foot that will help you stay in that ditch. There are some things you can do instead of stitching in the ditch. You can do top stitching. I typically don't like top stitching, so I rarely use that. Stitching in the ditch is my go-to. Or you can do a little edge stitching. That's just like top stitching, but a little closer, not necessarily there for a decorative stitch. It's really close to the seam line, so you could do that. And you could just do some hand stitching too, which I think is a lot more accurate. If you just did the stitching in the ditch by hand, it will definitely allow you to make sure you're going in the seam on the outer fabric and you're coming through the seam on the under fabric. I think you can get a lot of precision, probably the most precision you'll get with hand stitching. It just takes a long time, so I often don't do that. So now that you've mastered stitching in the ditch, take your seams to the next level and check out my next video here that tells you how to finish all your seams so your garment is as beautiful inside as it is out. And if you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.